Taliban wants to make a deal. We'll see if they want to make a deal. It's got to be a real deal, but we'll see. But they want to make a deal. And they only want to make a deal because you're doing a great job. That's the only reason they want to make a deal. But there's nowhere I'd rather celebrate this Thanksgiving than right here with the toughest, strongest, best and bravest warriors on the face of the earth. You are indeed that. Our citizens know that you're standing guard, killing terrorists, crushing our enemies, and keeping America safe, really safe. But you're also keeping it strong and proud and mighty and free. And I'm here today to just really say happy Thanksgiving, but also thank you very much. Great job. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
And we echo those sentiments. Joining us now with analysis of what's happening in Afghanistan and around the world is foreign policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, Nile Gardiner, Fox News contributor and former CIA chief of station Dan Hoffman, Fox News contributor Johnny Joey Jones, who served in Afghanistan. Johnny, let me start with you. Today's two attacks, Netherlands as well, but especially in London, because we know now that is a terrorist attack. The terrorists never really stop, and the threat of violence continues, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You know, they call these things lone wolf if they're not, in concert with a greater organization. Really, I hate that term because what we should say is they're inspired. They're inspired attacks, and they're inspired now because we live in an age of information where someone in their own mental or just overall situation is in peril, and they feel inspired by some other action that other people are doing to lash out and do things like this. And I think to understand it rather than fear it is important, so we should call it what it is. These are people that are inspired by these greater organizations, so there is a link there in that sense.
Niall, I want to shift to Afghanistan. Terrorism is the reason we went there 18 years ago. It's still the reason we're there. Taliban talks have resumed. What's the likelihood, in your judgment, of reaching some sort of accord?
I don't have a lot of faith and optimism in some kind of deal with the Taliban, a brutally evil Islamist terrorist organization. We have to fight the Islamist terrorists on the streets of London. We have to fight them in Afghanistan. We have to fight them in Iraq and Syria. And I have to say that I think the prospects for some kind of peace deal with the Taliban are very, very slim. It's vitally imperative, I think, that we do maintain a very strong, robust US military presence in Afghanistan to continue the fight against not only the Taliban, but also against their al-Qaeda allies and other Islamist terrorist organizations operating in the country, including ISIS. And this is a global war that we're fighting against the Islamists. And as we saw today on the streets of London, there are a large number of Islamist terrorists operating in Europe. These terrorists have to be emphatically defeated.
Dan, the Taliban is such a disparate and lawless collection of groups. Would an accord be worth the paper it's written on?
Yeah, I think we'd be in a mistrust and verify on a regular basis kind of scenario with them. The deputy of the Taliban is Siraj Haqqani, the leader of the infamous notorious Haqqani group, which has been responsible for suicide attacks against the United States and our allies and civilians in Afghanistan. They've also allowed al-Qaeda to homestead on their territory. I think there's a lot of, as Niall said, a lot of terrorist threats out there in Afghanistan. We need to be there to preempt those threats before they're visited on our shores. And I think going forward, we're going to need to maintain a presence there for some time, even if some peace deal is signed, so that we can make sure that we've dealt with those threats sufficiently before we withdraw our forces.
And Johnny, I mean, you know this region very well, so what's your view of it?
I think that any peace deal with the Taliban is something you do for today, not the long run. And so the real talks need to be between the Afghan government and the people that live within the borders of Afghanistan, and more importantly, those places like Pakistan where they allow people to have influence within the borders of Afghanistan. The big problem here is that Afghanistan does not have a national identity the way we do in the West. It's a tribal, territorial, and geographically regional area. You have the Pashtun region, you have different areas, the agricultural region, and there just isn't a fabric sewn to together the way we think of our country. And that's why the Taliban is able to be successful. I think what we need to understand is the Taliban's goals within the country of Afghanistan or Afghanistan and Pakistan, or do they have goals and intent beyond that that really would threaten us? And that's the decision we have to make. But to call it peace talks with the Taliban, to me, just is political fodder, and it's more about an election in a year than anything else. And as a Trump supporter going into that election, I just want things to be called what they are so that our troops on the ground there understand what they're in for and why they're there. I think they serve a great purpose. I think having their presence there to gather human intelligence and to keep attacks at bay makes a lot of sense.
You know, Niall, the president said we're either going to stay there until we reach a deal or total victory. Is total victory even possible? I mean, the British couldn't do it. The Soviets couldn't do it. We've been there 18 years.
Yeah.
Niall?
Well, I do think that, we have to stay there as long as we need to stay in Afghanistan in order to serve U.S. interests, actually. We have to protect the United States. We have to protect the homeland here against Islamist terrorist threats across the world. And we cannot allow Afghanistan once again to fall into the hands of those who would harm the United States and its allies directly. So this is certainly a very long war that we are engaged in. We have to have the resolve and the determination to defeat our enemies in Afghanistan, in Europe, and across the world. And so we have to really remain as long as is necessary in order to see this through.
You know, Trump critics say, oh, we're not making any progress, as if that's his fault. That is not something the Afghan president agreed with when he said today that the killing of al-Baghdadi was more meaningful in so many different ways than the killing of bin Laden. Would you agree?
I think it's awfully hard to compare the two, frankly. But listen, I think that one thing we need to keep in mind is that Afghanistan has not been used as a place to plan attacks against the United States since 9/11. We haven't been hit with any attacks since then. And so if we're asking whether it's a success or not, we've been successful. There's a difference between an ongoing presence, as Joey mentioned, and an endless war. Joey also made a really good point, I think, about what ultimately is of greatest importance here in determining how well this is all going to shake out, and that's the intra-Afghan dialogue. I think viewers should pay attention to whether Afghans are able to sit down amongst themselves and actually hash out a meaningful agreement between the Taliban and the government in Kabul and then all those disparate elements.
All right. Gentlemen, Niall, Dan, Johnny, many thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.